Welcome everyone. Today we are learning about Mars-Pluto aspects. So I spoke last week that in this series there's going to come a point where we have a polarity. So Pluto, Venus are a polarity in the sense that Venus rules Taurus and Pluto rules Scorpio. We're also always going to have in each series an octave relationship. So this is one of them. Pluto and Mars are octaves of one another. So what that means is they're both sort of relating to the same archetype, just expressing at different dimensions of being. Both Mars and Pluto, in their own way, correspond to the archetype of will, desire. Well, we can say actually Mars specifically as will, but both of them correspond to desire. What we're going to learn here is actually a very essential part of the evolutionary astrology teaching. So we're not just going to tune into the meaning of Mars and Pluto in aspect. We're really going to spend some time understanding the significance, the importance of their relationship to one another. Being that they both correspond to desire, let's just take a moment to understand what is the archetype of desire, how does it correspond to Pluto and to Mars. So as I've taught in the intro, desire from a Pluto perspective corresponds to the underlying desire nature of the soul. It's what brings us into incarnation to have experience. Desire from the perspective of Mars is more of a specific focusing of personal will. I want this. I'm desiring this particular object. I am saying yes to this, I'm saying no. There's a very particular, specific focus within the Mars archetype where we're going to feel an instinctual reaction to life experience. Pluto doesn't operate on that level. Pluto doesn't operate on an instinctual level implicitly. I mean, Pluto is fundamentally about the underlying program of the soul. What's the evolutionary intention? What are the underlying desires? Like, the soul doesn't come here to desire a cup of espresso. The soul doesn't come here to, fill in the blank with any particular object focus. That's all manifesting on the level of Mars. And so when you understand these two planets together, we can actually appreciate that Mars is simply the planetary function that will channelize and execute, move us into experience through choices, through actions, with respect to our underlying soul, desire, and intention. We can say that Mars is a conscious component within us that initiates the desires originating from the soul. How are we going to initiate these desires? These desires will be initiated through particular choices. And so all the 10,000 choices that we make in life, while it may not specifically be about the Pluto position in your chart, Mars is like the soldier that's going out there and following the commands of the soul. Do this, do that, choose that. Ultimately, we have to ask the question with Mars, what is the basis for the choices that we're making? What is the underlying intention and goal for all of the choices that we're making in life? So we can think on the level of Mars. We have all kinds of desires, all kinds of intentions. We're going to respond to experience instinctually. Life will challenge us. Life will instigate strong feelings within us. But we're always brought back to this point where we then choose how to respond. On the most gross level of consciousness, there isn't much of a choice. On the most unrefined level of self-awareness, Mars is going to be purely instinctive reactivity. But we learn through experience by way of actions about the consequences of our actions or the consequences of our inactions. When I'm feeling angry, when I'm feeling triggered and I act on that trigger, I might learn, if there's some wisdom and self-reflection applied to it, that this often just instigates more violence back towards me. If I put my hands in fire, I'm going to get hurt. If I just impulsively do whatever I want to do and move in whatever direction I want to make whenever I want to, it isn't always going to result in a positive outcome. So something that happens for all of us on the Mars journey, just looking at Mars, is progressively we become more self-aware of not just the effects of our actions, but what are we trying to achieve? Like, what do we really want? That self-reflectiveness on where am I trying to go? What am I trying to get to? What are my goals? What is it I really want out of life? None of us are able to answer that right away in the beginning of our life experience. We develop that self-wisdom because all of our experiences, our choices, our reactions are bringing life back to us, reflecting back to us exactly where we're at. I got angry and then they yelled at me. I just ate what I wanted to eat and now I feel this way. I took whatever I wanted to take. I didn't say no when I should have said no. It all gives us essential feedback for where we're at. And is this where I want to be? Is this taking me where I want to go? So the Mars function essentially brings forward enough experience that if we're orienting from an evolutionary perspective, if we're orienting from the stance of I want to evolve and actually have a meaningful life, we're going to actually point back to our Pluto dynamics. Right? We're going to come back to what is the underlying soul program here. And so fundamentally, all of the choices and the different ways that we can respond to life experience is creating a field of potential self-awareness and experience that will teach us, where do I really want to go? What's my goal? And thus we learn how to sublimate or redirect that instinctual energy consciously. The conscious execution of that Mars raw, untamed energy is what happens as we grow in self-awareness. That's the key here. And this is how Mars points back to Pluto. Because fundamentally, from a Pluto perspective, it comes back down to a binary. Cooperate or resist evolutionary necessity. That's fundamentally what it's about. Am I going to cooperate or resist the imperative for evolutionary growth? The cooperation or resistance will be expressed simply by way of the choices we're making. Right? If I'm just going to do whatever I want and react instinctively, that's going to say something about how my life is going to go. Right? If I just steal something because I want it, that's going to say something about the direction of my own life and where it's heading. It's not necessarily going to lead to a lot of soul growth. But if I can repress those instinctual impulses and actually become self-reflective, if I can abstain from the immediacy, Mars, of saying that thing, doing that thing, reacting, then I'm actually allowing that energy to be used consciously with more thoughtfulness and agency. Thoughtfulness and agency are the keys here. Now, it's necessary within Mars, for any Mars signature, to be free and to know ourselves as free, because knowing ourselves as free means we know that we can make choices or we can make new choices. It means we have the agency to be able to choose our response. Without knowing that we have the freedom to choose our response, we're either going to feel deeply subdued or, held back. Something out there is imposing and blocking my own needed freedom. Or we're going to feel possessed by our instinctual responses. So needing to have that experience of that level of self-knowledge where I know that I am free, that I know I am empowered enough to consciously make a choice here. Then it says something so profound, and again points back to the relationship between the underlying soul desires of Pluto and the way we execute and act and behave and fulfill actions in this human life. I can draw upon a deeper strength and power within me and choose my response. I can draw upon a deeper capacity, a deeper strength, a deeper clarity of intention within me to evolve, to grow, relative to my goals in life. And I can choose to respond accordingly. And again, this is something that we only develop when there's an adequate amount of life feedback that essentially gives us the kind of feedback that we need to become more self-aware and self-reflective. So everything that I've been saying up until this point highlights in general, and hopefully it's being clear, the general relationship between Mars and Pluto. There's a really great talk that I did with Chris and Fontana. I've referenced it before in introducing aspects and phases. Definitely check out this free talk. I usually post it in the description below. This is a helpful framework for then understanding in general the relationship between Mars and Pluto in any natal chart, even if there isn't an aspect. So let's dive into right now the essential relationship and aspects between Mars and Pluto. Let me just say one more thing about Mars, and it really can't be emphasized enough. Just expanding on the idea that we need to know that we're free to make choices. That knowledge of one's freedom and agency doesn't ever exist for anyone in an absolute sense. Like, we're not free to make any choice we want because we're limited. Each soul in this human experience is faced with very present, clear, obvious limitations. And so we can have a desire, we can find ourselves engaging our will, but sort of pushing up against the limitations of what simply cannot be. And there are certain things that simply cannot be. Similarly to a child can kick and scream. The parents might be holding them, and the parents know there's no way in the world this child is going to get that candy. The child can want it as much as they want, but there's a limit. There's a boundary here. Or the child might want to drive the car. They're not going to drive the car. It's not going to happen. Right? So part of the maturation within the Mars archetype is sort of being thrown back to ourselves. We might deeply want to have something or get something or go somewhere. And this is an important thing to understand, because when the will is adequately strong enough, because we're strong beings, the soul is powerful. We have power inside of us. It's inexpressible. So when our will is really, really, really strong, we can, in fact, push ourselves and control life conditions and manipulate ourselves deeply enough to get where we want to go, but to a point, right? Like, we can resist the soul program, but that's just going to give us more and more feedback, right? Like, life's just going to say back to us, hey, the flow of the Tao isn't really going that way, right? You're going to get a lot of negative feedback, a lot of negative consequences. You can use your will, but there's going to be a point where we have to exhaust that. And this is helpful when we understand Mars and Pluto together, because it always really brings up that question, when do I keep on pushing versus when do I let go? Right? When to say, I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to will myself forward in life and say, this is what I want. I'm going to make it happen. And when do we just let go? And there's no objective way of gauging that. I mean, there comes a point on this whole journey where we actually need to claim a deeper level of entitlement and clarity to say, yes, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make this work. And actually overcoming obstacles is a matter of saying my will and my desire and my intention and my willpower is stronger than my environment. Yes, I'm going to stick with this diet. Yes, I'm going to follow this practice. Yes, I'm going to train and I'm going to apply to the job and I'm going to get that job and I'm going to get that promotion. We can use our willpower and grow because we're focused. And that will bring growth. All of these experiences will bring forth something within us that says you're more powerful, you have the ability, you focus, you concentrated, you have the capacity to achieve your goals. But on the other side of it, we can say, I'm gonna win this. I'm gonna win this fight. I'm gonna win this battle. I'm gonna win this argument. I'm gonna, get for the 10th year in a row, I'm gonna win this competition. And there comes a point where our focus of will is no longer serving our own evolutionary growth. And we just have to discern that from within our own self. To what extent are we holding on to a program that is an attachment to a form of security and power, and resisting the need to let go and move on to something new? Because the Pluto journey is always generating and exhausting desire. We come into life experience, we have relationship, we engage with life, we osmose experience into us, we grow, we become something new, but then we let it go, we move on to something else. There's an ongoing process. And it's very easy if we're stuck on the achievement of our personal will and desires, and we're pushing it, and it's no longer about I'm growing, it's more about I need to get this, I need the control, right? And so there's a difference between the healthy strengthening of willpower and strengthening ourselves by doing greater things and growing into greater strength and capacity, versus becoming victimized by life experience and needing to make things work out the way that you want them. We can use our willpower to manipulate and force circumstances, but that's very different than using our willpower to grow. And it points back to Pluto. It's the energy of cooperation or the energy of resistance. When we're in an orientation of cooperation, we're going to do whatever it takes. And Mars-Pluto corresponds to the need to adequately engage one's will to say, I'm going to do whatever it takes to evolve beyond my existing limitations and become something more. And however we want to apply that, right, to use that willpower to grow into something more, is I'm going to do whatever it takes to get out of this addiction, to understand what is the psychological basis for these patterns, for this addictive behavior. I'm going to practice, I'm going to train, I'm going to get stronger. I'm going to concentrate my will and my desire towards new choices, whatever it takes. And it's all about desire. The more we cultivate that clarity of desire, the more we're going to concentrate on new choices, new actions, new activities. That's going to become our bottom line. But when we use that willpower relative to our own resistance, it says, I'm so afraid of losing or not having that which I've determined that I'm going to do whatever it takes to win, to get ahead, to be better than. And there's an underlying psychology of victimization. And this should not be confused by a healthy dose of realizing, if I am not making conscious choices in my own life, I'm not going to get where I want to go. And so that realization can actually bring with it a sort of fear. Right? There can be a sort of awareness of, oh my, if I actually don't put forth more effort, I'm not going to get anywhere. If I'm constantly waiting for something to happen, or for circumstances to change, or depending on things outside of myself, I'm never going to become who I want to become. So that can really bring us into a greater place of self-leadership. But it's very different than saying, I'm, going to make sure that I speak the words or do the thing that's going to put me on top. That is the misuse of willpower. And the Mars-Pluto in so many ways will speak to that karmic pattern of misusing that willpower energy. We can use aggression and force and sexual energy and desire in all kinds of ways that becomes a matter of domination. And when we're engaging on the level of domination, it's a false form of achieving power. And it's not really bringing a true sense of growth and soul empowerment. In a positive way, that energy can be transmuted by becoming really into sports, right? Like, I'm going to dominate, right? I'm going to win this game. That's different, right? And this is where we find all kinds of creative ways of transmuting this energy. A lot of people with Mars-Pluto get really, really into really extreme things. It could be music even. But it's a way of deeply osmosing through that experience a deeper connection to their own power and their ability to be clear and focused and to achieve. And even to win, right? But that's like an external idea of, I'm going to become really, really good at this. And that focus on sports or music or competition might be a very healthy way of taking that very competitive or angry energy, giving it a conscious focus. So we always have to appreciate that with Mars, Pluto, and Pluto aspects in general, oftentimes we'll find these ways of consciously transmuting some pretty dark stuff, right? There can be the energy of very abusive, violent content inside, but that's being transmuted. On the other side too, right? You can find with Mars, Pluto being in a deep state of victimization. where violence and other people who have a stronger power or will over you are controlling so you're feeling victimized, and that your freedom to act or respond is being limited. So a lot of souls with Mars Pluto will find themselves having had experiences where they're being controlled or their freedom is being limited in some essential way, right? So that sort of aggressive masculine energy is on the outside, and it's imposing itself upon oneself, right? Many times Mars Pluto will be one or the other, often both at different times or in different lives. Not always, but often. And having that Mars Pluto says basically that raw energy lives inside of you. And oftentimes when we're not claiming that, that becomes a shadow. And that shadow can either be a shadow that's leaking out of us, sort of an aggression or an anger or a resentment or a victimization, right? Where we don't feel that we have the power to take control over our own life. That we don't have the power to make conscious choices. That we don't have the power to say yes, to say no, to actually have any control over the direction or movement of our life. Where other wills are controlling our own. Or we're just not in touch with it. And other people are holding that energy that we're not claiming ourselves. So other people are going to step in and say, hey, you're not leading your life, you're not controlling, and so I'm going to control you. The soul can even be attracted to people that are very dominating or controlling or aggressive as a way of subconsciously reflecting back to the soul where they are called to actually claim their own self-leadership. But it's a way of becoming self-aware of what is not being consciously claimed. And thus even the experience of feeling victimized or limited or controlled. Right? The anger that can come when choices are being made or circumstances or dynamics are happening in life and I don't feel any control over them, right? That can bring forth a lot of anger. That anger ultimately serves the purpose to bring the soul back to itself. Where can I claim conscious choice making? How is this reflecting where I'm not in touch with my own soul program? And this is the point. When we're in touch with our soul program, when we know we are responsible for our own soul evolution, that doesn't coincide with any victimization. What happens around us does not affect our sense of empowerment or disempowerment or victimization when we deeply know that we are responsible for our own soul growth. It's an essential psychological state of being. When we know that we are responsible for our own soul growth, we know that we are responsible for our choices and for our own vibration. We are responsible for how we choose to respond to every experience. And when we're programming ourselves towards evolution, we're going to orient our attention inwards to respond in ways that actually elicits more growth and empowerment. We will stay further and further away from the victimization. And yet if that arises in us, what develops in time for many souls with Mars Pluto is a deep penetrating psychological self-awareness and ability to take full responsibility for even the anger and the victimization. Okay, this is happening in here. How can I integrate that in a healthy and conscious way? The key is to recognize this is pointing to where I'm being called into greater strength, greater capacity to make choices that supports my own evolution. And it sometimes means not getting what I want. It sometimes means experiencing and embracing the limitations of my life experience, where things aren't going to go the way I want them to go. Life isn't going to show up the way I want. People aren't going to be the way I want them to be. There are going to be limits. But how am I choosing to respond to it anyway? Okay. So let's talk more about sexuality when it comes to Mars and Pluto. Because of course, Mars corresponds to the more yang expression, the masculine expression of sexuality. Literally, Mars corresponds to the penis and just the masculine expressions of external desire, right? Moving outwards, penetrating, okay? We all have this. This is not about male and female, but within the Mars-Pluto archetype, there is going to be a very strong desire to either penetrate. I have this desire and I'm going to penetrate, right? It's a very strong sexual craving, or a strong lust or a strong desire to express oneself in life and move towards whatever object of desire there is. If that is expressed instinctually or in a way that is not accounting to consequence, that can actually cause a lot of mess. But it's interesting because Mars always has consequence. There's no action that doesn't have a consequence. So everything you do is going to create karma. And it's really a matter of the karmic patterns that we establish. They're not good or bad implicitly. It's more like it's going to set in motion a chain of experiences that will then lead to more growth. So we can express ourselves instinctually on a sexual level, and there might be consequences to that, right? Are we coming from a rageful, instinctive place that's just taking what it wants, right? And that's where, with that energy, there might be a deep karmic need for a soul to learn how to work with that consciously, to transmute sexual energy beyond just a raw instinctual expression. And there can be a deep desire to be penetrated as well, right? That is one end of the spectrum of wanting to access the depth within one's own soul, right? So we can always find ourselves on both sides of that equation. The desire to penetrate or the desire to be penetrated. We can't speak enough to the importance of transmutation, because transmutation, which is a Pluto word, is essential with Mars. Transmutation says there are sort of limits here. I'm going to limit the freedom of my choices and be with a strong sensation, be with a strong desire, because I'm transmuting this raw energy into a higher level of purpose, a higher level of consciousness. The ability to restrain oneself allows for that transmutation to occur. But this is a hard thing with Mars-Pluto. When we restrain ourselves, what do you do with that energy? That's the point. When you don't act on that impulse, what does Mars do? Where does it go? So we have this deep psychological need that isn't being expressed and executed through conscious action with Mars. What is a person to do about that fundamentally? So this is why it's very necessary along the soul journey for the soul to create avenues and directions for very strong visceral activity through which they can continue to grow and transmute this energy. Having goals, things that the soul is orienting towards in life, where they can use and direct a lot of that energy. And we shouldn't really judge what those goals are. We shouldn't judge it because, right, you can be a serial killer, you can be a rapist, you can be deeply victimized, and sort of metaphorically, those energies can be inside of you. And whatever goal you've chosen, that might be a way of transmuting that goal, right? So a person might choose to get really into all kinds of strange taboo things, but it's being done consciously. And that's the point. A soul might be really getting into, desires and practices and cultivations that are maybe from the outside look very dark, right? But it's actually a way of consciously working with this energy that, if it wasn't conscious, actually would be very destructive and harmful. Likewise, the soul can channel that in art, in creativity, in acting, in work. It could be like, I have this desire to, become really, really rich or grow really, really big muscles. And we can judge that. But they might be working with a really visceral energy. And that might be a way of channeling it, right? For so many souls, channeling this visceral energy towards whatever goals are the way to actually begin to transmute it and find one's strength in life. It's really important that we appreciate that and we don't judge that. In fact, this whole soul evolutionary process is fueled by the ability to become. To say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to move in this direction, I'm going to become more, I'm going to move in a new experience and set these goals. And then we'll let go of that goal. That's better than just being completely passive and not making any choices of one's own, because we're still going to be making choices anyway. And that's the thing with Mars. We're always choosing. We're always making choices anyway. So if we're not consciously orienting our attention in some sort of purposeful direction, we're going to be making choices anyway. And we'll see some of the examples that I got really express that in a beautiful way. So let me take a look at my notes here. So, let's look at the idea of defensiveness. There's a beautiful set of teachings in A Course in Miracles that corresponds to the proper use of negation. There is a very powerful use of the will and no on the spiritual path, which is the ability to say no to that which will undermine the clarity of our purpose, the clarity of our intention, right? Self-defeating thoughts or behaviors or actions that actually will get in the way of our spiritual cultivation or whatever goals we're seeking for, right? It could even be like, I'm, training to become an athlete. I'm going to say no to staying late at that party and drinking all night, right? We have to be able to say no to that, to things that will undermine our goal. That no means we're drawing upon a deeper soul level intention for what we're saying yes to. It's really important to understand that. The presence of strong no's and even the ability to say no to one's thoughts or behavior and say, I'm not going there, is really essential here. In a way, being instigated by experiences or temptations and saying, no thank you, I'm not doing that, I'm not going there, are one of the strongest ways that we actually end up affirming and strengthening our positive intentions for life. Negatively, the use of defense is seeing that something or someone out there is limiting or controlling us. So Mars-Pluto can become incredibly defensive. Basically, wherever it's perceived that someone or something is getting in the way of my needed freedom, I'm going to see them as the perpetrator against my own soul. And thus, in that mentality, anything I do or say is going to be justified because I'm fighting against that which is limiting me. And whatever we perceive, the temptation for victimization is really strong here. Until we become fully self-responsible, the possibility of seeing another person is fundamentally limiting me. That's only going to say we are not taking responsibility for our own soul program. I have to fight and win and defeat this person. And that's very energetically different than being able to say no to the temptation of engaging in something that will lower our vibration. Rather, in this case, we actually lower our vibration by getting into a defensive, argumentative, war-like stance. And yet, as per Mars, sometimes this is how we learn. Sometimes it's just by getting messy, and we'll see this. Really, that's kind of the learning curve of Mars. And Mars-Pluto, like, ooh, that was really intense. Wow, that was a lot of anger. That was a lot of power struggle. I don't want to do that. Like, these experiences will oftentimes, again, as per Mars, bring us the life feedback for how do I want to act? How do I want to actually behave? It'll bring us into the field of greater self-awareness, potentially, right? There's always the possibility of just being endlessly victimized. And we have to appreciate when other people are doing something negative to us, the temptation with Mars-Pluto is, fight, flight, fawn. All the sort of instinctual, defensive reactions that might happen. If we've been coming from a place of not knowing our ability to say no, or to react to things, or to respond to things, it might be healing to actually access the anger or the defensiveness for a moment. But that's just a part of the journey, right? Like, going from total passivity to anger is healthy. We're accessing a raw energy that we haven't been in touch with, but we don't want to live there forever. We want to be able to work with that anger and say, okay, this is good. I'm feeling my blood. I'm feeling my life pulse. What am I going to do with that? What am I going to do with my life? I think one of the biggest issues with Mars-Pluto is we don't adequately say yes to our own soul program. And so we don't make choices. We don't engage and exercise our power to the extent that we can. Mars-Pluto fundamentally as a tagline is the immense strength of your willpower. And that our willpower is so important and so powerful if we understand our capacity to make better choices in life. And oftentimes we're going to be instigated to do that during cataclysmic experiences. So if you got these really strong Mars-Pluto aspects, like more hard aspects, or Mars is, being transited by Pluto, let's say, it might be hard, but the positive is those will be times where we might actually be adequately instigated to say yes and claim more of our own soul program. So it's difficult, painful, might really bring up a deeper sense of victimization, but it's going to push us to get on with our life. It's going to push us to say, it is not my purpose in life to feel powerless or victimized. I got to make a different choice here. Let me say one more thing about Mars. I think this is something in particular that we often get confused with on the spiritual path. And that really is understanding that our evolutionary journey isn't about just going with the flow and being passive and peaceful and serene all the time. Evolution means facing our psychological limitations. It means facing our addictions, our fears, our compulsions, where we have not claimed our own power from within. When we meet those edges, we are not going to be comfortable. Hands down. When someone does or says something, or circumstances in our life are triggering for us, it's going to point to what is unconscious within us. That is not comfortable. The practice is to meet that and not bring more fear into the equation. The practice is to learn how to trust and understand, okay, I'm feeling threatened. This is a part of my soul program to evolve right here now. That's the practice. But we get there by way of first feeling insecure. And it's rare for anyone to feel insecure or threatened and to meet it immediately 100% of the time with the stance of cooperation and self-responsibility. It's pretty rare, especially if we set in motion already certain patterns of reactivity or victimization or powerlessness. Or if we're in certain addictive behaviors, right? Mars, Pluto can be the essence of addiction. We're focused on the object of desire, the person, place, thing that we determine that we need or we want, and we need it. And if it's not coming to us, if we're not getting it, we'll try harder to get it. I mean, Mars, Pluto can be can be like a dictator, affirming this is what I need and this is what I'm gonna get, even when it's not easy. Because without it, I feel fundamentally insecure. The Pluto need to osmose something from the outside within can be so intense that I'm going to be forceful with my will, because without it, I can't face the deep vulnerability and insecurity that I experience on the inside. And so to actually meet those patterns, which can be incredibly aggressive, incredibly dominating, and again, or on the flip side, incredibly weak, and I don't know how to act. I feel victimized and powerless in this situation. Or going back and forth between anger and powerlessness. There has to be a ground in absolute self-responsibility. So I just say this because I think we should appreciate that this life journey is often pretty darn messy. Any of us have Pluto Mars or have experienced Pluto transiting over Mars, we know what it's like. We know that it can be really messy. But the point is we learn. The point is every action and reaction sets in motion a karmic pattern, which ultimately serves fundamentally to reflect back to us the interior of our own consciousness. What's happening, what's operating on the inside, which then brings us to make new choices. And as always, the bottom line program is desire. What do we want? What do we really want? And what are we willing to do to get there? Doing whatever it takes to evolve might mean being really uncomfortable, really, really threatened, really, really insecure. It might take years to unpack that, right? To make a choice and to make a commitment to transmute our own energy, to consciously do something. Right, there's circumstances eliciting what we maybe didn't want to do, but on a deep soul level, we're asking for. Or we can make conscious choices that are going to be hard, but we're going to stick with it, right? This is just one of those things with Mars. We look back at our life and we say, okay, with all of my effort, am I getting where I want to be? The Aries archetype is in a natural square to the Capricorn Saturn archetype. So we can really understand it, when we really connect these archetypes together. Mars does point to Saturn in the sense that Saturn says, what are we building long term, right? Mars is the person building the house, right? Carrying the bricks, laying the foundation, taking the commands of the soul to execute these actions. Our choices and our reactions and our decisions in life, from a Saturn point of view, are we building a structural reality that we want to be living in? From a Pluto point of view, fundamentally, is that structural reality in resonance with our soul program? Are we evolving and becoming the person and the soul that we're wanting to become? Are we unleashing and evolving and awakening to more of our inherent power? Or are we just circling addictively around the same loops of struggle over and over and over again? Mars-Pluto people are here to evolve. So, transitioning into some of our charts, you see a lot of Mars-Pluto people, they get involved in really catalyzing really, really strong life experiences. And it's necessary. It's absolutely necessary for them to be deeply engaged, deeply instigated by life experience, because they need to move through this karmic stuff. They need to say, I'm going to work through this. I'm going to be triggered. I'm going to grow. I'm going to evolve. I'm going to let go and do something new. Maybe I'll be playing out a stage of victimization and anger, and I'll become an activist or a freedom fighter, or I'll be a violent person. That's a stage. And that's going to happen, and then we're going to say, here's a better way of acting. It's always about moving through an experience and then realizing a more refined, helpful, evolved way. Okay, so let me see if there are any questions before I move on. Okay, great. So Paul McCartney, a really interesting example. He's one of the Beatles, was one of the Beatles. Mars, Pluto, in Leo, in the 11th house. You can tell the 11th house has a lot of importance. Chiron's there, the moon is there. I mean, a lot of really intimate signatures are constellating around this 11th house. I want to give attention to the time where the Beatles were breaking up. This was traumatizing for Paul. When he speaks about it, he says, yeah, when John left and we were breaking up, I was depressed, right? The band, but 11th house is the band, right? A musical band that you're playing in. Leo in the 11th house, like you and your boys. And this team, he even said, it felt like, you're in an army with your friends, and now suddenly you're all breaking up. It's, again, your army, a legion of people, 11th house. For him, the musical collaboration, I mean, all of his music, all of his songs, mostly during the time of the Beatles, was a collaborative experience between him and John. The friendship was a way of channeling all he loved. When he met John, he loved his musicality. He's like, oh, this is so cool. I love this guy. And being able to play together in a band was a way that he channeled all of this energy. And then the loss, I would say, in my interpretation, the betrayal, right, of John progressively losing interest, becoming more interested in Yoko, feeling betrayed, right? He even wrote that song, You Took Your Lucky Break and Split It into Two. I mean, there's sort of like a song battle between John and Paul after John left the Beatles. Thankfully they reconciled later on, and Paul really worked with this energy deeply. He was like, what do I do? Do I keep on playing music? And he decided to continue to play music, and he continued to channel all of this energy. He formed the next band, right, with other musicians that he wanted to play with. He kept on playing music. This is a soul that committed himself to the freedom of his own creativity. Right? He wanted to liberate this Mars energy, Leo in the 11th house, and keep it flowing, keep it moving, and not allow himself to get stuck in the disempowerment, become this old, angry person. So many bands that break up, and then for decades, like, they don't talk to each other, and they stop playing music. They just become resentful. He was committed to keeping that creativity moving and keeping himself in life, not allowing himself to get stuck in darkness. But we can really see how vulnerable that was for him, even Taurus in the 8th square. There's a lot of deep sense of this impacting a sense of value and worth, a feeling of loss and betrayal. I mean, there's a lot there that just speaks to a sense of, deep hurt. There's a lot to say with that Chiron moon as well. What I found interesting is I was curious. This chart right here, August of 1969, this isn't the official. The official breakup legally was like 4 years later or 5 years later. But this was the time period where they were pretty much breaking up. There were several years. And Pluto was moving over his ascendant. It would have been in 1970, I think, where Pluto actually moved back and forth over his ascendant. That year. I'm pretty sure that year Pluto was over, but then back and forth again over that next year as well. So that was that time period. Pluto was moving back and forth over his ascendant, and that's useful. Like, this is Pluto moving over the ascendant is a Mars energy, right? Here's another spin on Pluto and Mars, both in transit or natally, and obviously archetypally, this is similar to Pluto on the ascendant, Pluto in the first. All of these teachings archetypally can be understood in that way. Or Pluto transiting Mars or over the ascendant. It says there's fundamentally the need to clear the past and start a new path of new actions. Because Mars is about beginnings, initiation, instinctual, right? It's fundamentally how we're instinctually making choices. And we're going to be implementing new choices with respect to whatever desires we're needing to move forward within our own soul. And so an aspect like that says there's a whole cycle coming to a close, and you can't do the same thing that you were doing before, and that's a hard ending. But then there's new life after that. And this is a great example of a soul who, well, he began his own solo career. This is also a good example of, within the 11th house, the community is inside. If you become too addicted, too stuck on my security is linked to the group, eventually you'll need to come back to yourself and realize, well, I'm also inside of myself. The group, the community, the band is inside, right? Being able to unleash all of these characteristics and qualities that were in the community are also living inside of me. And it'll always reorganize and show up on the outside as I claim it on the inside, as opposed to becoming jaded and I'm not going to play with anyone. I'm not going to get together with anyone ever again. It's actually an interesting story I just read this morning where both Paul and John in the 70s were actually in New York. Paul was with John in his apartment. And apparently on Saturday Night Live, Lorne Michaels put out a call for, Paul and John to come together and, play. And they were actually considering walking to the Saturday Night Live studio in that moment, but they were too tired, so they didn't. There's something about that story that's endearing to me because I love the idea of the breakup, right? The Beatles broke up, but then the bonds of friendship came back together. I think there's something really powerful about that where Pluto, the forms change, but as long as we're not carrying these underlying resentments perpetually so, there's always going to be a new form and a new configuration that occurs later on. It's interesting too. One more point on Paul. There was a need for decisive action, Pluto Mars. He had to actually make this choice, or he made the choice to sue the Beatles because there's an issue with the company that they were with that was owning all of the music. Basically said any individual creative work that any of the individual Beatles do is property of the Beatles as a company. And he wanted to have rights over his own music and make his own song. So he had to actually sue the Beatles in order to claim rights to his own music. That's another piece of that Mars-Pluto, right? The use of, I got to be decisive and clear in order to claim the sovereignty and the independence of my own soul path. Otherwise, he would have been making music, but Apple company or whatever it was would have owned that music. Okay, let's move on to our next example, Malcolm X. This is a really good example as well. So he has Mars, Pluto in Cancer in the 7th house, another conjunction. Just note too, Pluto rules Saturn, and we have Saturn squaring the nodes here. So this Scorpio is very strong in the chart, right? Pluto squaring this, Pluto ruling the Saturn and Scorpio in the 10th. There's this very strong scorpionic theme in this chart. This is a soul that early on lost his father. His father was murdered. His mother, I think, was hospitalized, and he lost connection with his mother. He got into stealing and crime. He was an angry person. Basically saw racism and became incredibly jaded, incredibly distrustful of white people, and just angry at society in general. You can really see that, with Saturn up there in Scorpio. But there's a sort of deep sense of injustice, right? His whole thing was justice, right? And the idea of the other, right? Other, 7th house, right? In this case, it's people that are not like me, the white people. There's an interview, he said, where we have conservatives are outright, racist. But more liberal whites, they're nice to you, they're kind to you, but they're still going to use you. Right? There's an underlying sense of, I am not safe, accepted, loved, welcomed by society, by white people. And so as he was radicalized in jail by the Nation of Islam, he became further polarized in this idea of, I'm going to stand by defending and protecting, even with violence, against these people that we cannot trust fundamentally. And we can see fundamentally that Mars-Pluto is a deep feeling of hurt, betrayal, rejection. That actually in his soul, he wants togetherness. And the underlying core program of the soul is about harmony and safety and inclusion. But listening, about caring. But there's such a deep sense of rejection. And there's this interesting talk, it's kind of a funny talk, where he was talking about how there's this expectation that they should be nonviolent. And he was saying, oh yeah, sure, I'm going to persecute you, but make sure you're nonviolent. And make sure that you respond peacefully. But I'm going, if we're going to go to war, we're not going to call that violence. We're going to call that war. Or we're going to persecute, black people, right? But black people, you got to be nonviolent. Right? It's all these ideas of how they're being treated. It's like, imagine that of being in a relationship and being controlled by your partner, right? Being controlled by someone else that has a lot more power over you. There's a sort of, I'm putting my foot down. I'm not going to be disempowered by this relationship anymore. And one of the things that he really was a strong proponent of was black people forming their own. It wasn't about integration within society. It was about, let us form our own society. Let us form our own institutions where we are empowered. Now, what's really interesting is, at a certain point, he went on a pilgrimage where he met many people of the Islamic faith of all races. And this was a powerful spiritual experience for him, because this was a very 7th house moment for him. There were people getting along. There were people giving and sharing and listening to each other and caring for each other. White people, Arab people, black people. And when he saw that happening, he had a change of heart. He realized it's possible to get along with people that are different than you. Right? Mars, Pluto in the 7th house. This is like the evolution. There's more safety here. We can care for each other. And so his shift became more about not so much fighting and the whole Nation of Islam. He left that. And it became more about uniting African American people and teaching African American people to be proud of themselves, to love themselves, right? But he became more open to allyship and support. It became less about rejecting and fighting against or differentiating ourselves from the white people, and became more about, we need to love ourselves. We need to honor ourselves, because we were told that we're ugly, we're second class, we're not important, but we are. We're beautiful, we're important. So there's a very significant shift here. And so he's just a great example. And of course, he was murdered during one of his talks. And it's not uncommon for Mars Pluto to have either prior to this lifetime having experienced murder or violence or having done that themselves, or for them to experience that in this life. It's just we're dealing with a lot of visceral energy. It's in our field. And we're moving through it, and we're learning how to integrate it. Fundamentally, we're transmuting that energy. This is a soul on his journey. It's very clear. His soul trajectory is being about a peace activist. His soul journey is about a fierce, and this is my interpretation, a fierce determination to get to the bottom line of where does peace truly come from. There's a quote in A Course in Miracles, "In my defenselessness, my safety lies." When I am victimized and defending against a perceived threat, I'm attesting to my vulnerability. That Mars Pluto wants to get into the heart, into the depth, to the power of caring and harmonizing, but fiercely so. That Leo North Node, there's just a lot to say about, in my view, the ongoing trajectory of the soul's ongoing realization. That's my perspective on that. Okay, let's look at our final example. Another conjunction today. This is a great example. Hillary Clinton, right? Mars, Pluto with Saturn, also all squaring the nodes. This is an absolute balsamic conjunction, this Mars and Pluto. So, clearly, this is a soul that has wanted to wield a lot of power. South Node in Scorpio in the first house, ruled by this Pluto in Leo in the ninth. The desires here and the unresolved desires squaring the nodes have been about, I want to be seen, I want to be believed, I want to have credibility with that Saturn there, and I want to have a lot of power to be a leader, right? To will my own destiny, to speak my truth, to be respected, to be, Leo in the ninth house. Listen to me, I'm important, and to forge my own destiny. So for her, a lot of this had a lot to do with, being the first woman president, which is a strong ambition of hers to claim her own destiny, her own life path. And one of the experiences that she had, just focusing on one dimension, is running for presidency in 2016. And we can, whatever your opinion of her politically or otherwise, right? There are two dimensions that I want to say. There was a lot of criticism for her around the ways that she tried to disempower and even lie about Bernie Sanders, who was running against her for the Democratic ticket. Okay? So there's a sort of, in my view, that Mars, Pluto, I want to win, and I'll do whatever it takes, even if it means being dishonest. And then on the other end of that, she's a candidate and she's running against Donald Trump, right? And Donald Trump, you can say, sort of represents that Mars energy now, right? Like here we have the situation of her being on two sides of the coin. This is my interpretation, right? I'm going to be the dominating, controlling energy that in this case is going to do whatever it takes to win. Or I'm going to be dominated and controlled by some sort of external, aggressive, masculine energy that's going to do whatever it wants to do to win, right? How infuriating it was for her to win the popular vote by a million people, but to actually win to actually lose the electorate vote here in the U.S. and lose the presidency. And there's this one really interesting moment where she's on stage, and she's debating Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is like right behind her, following her like a stalker, and it was creepy. Like looking at it, it's like oof. But it was like this psychological trick that Donald Trump was employing to dominate. Right? He's totally playing that I'm going to dominate you and make you feel small. That, imagine how infuriating and karmically triggering that is for this soul. With I don't want to be small. And there's a memory of having lost that South Node in the first house, right? I lost the forces more powerful than myself, and I'm determined not to be small. And here we have evolutionary forces. She wasn't able to make it this time. So a great example of limits in what a person can achieve and how life, you can try your hardest, will say, okay, here are the evolutionary limits, but what are you going to do with that? How are you going to get up from that, and what are you going to do next? How are you going to integrate those experiences and move on? What are you going to learn from it, right? So I find that to be a really powerful example. Okay, so let me see here if there are any questions. Is Mars-Pluto conjunction about betrayal or rejection, or just because it is in the seventh? Anywhere. I mean, so wherever Mars, in regards to Paul, or Malcolm X. In both cases, anywhere where Mars Pluto is, we can have anywhere where Pluto is, we can have the issue of betrayal. The archetype of rejection specifically is a Libra 7th house archetype. In the 11th house, this can also be one of alienation or being ostracized by your friends, things like that, or the trauma of a community breaking up, things like that. But the core archetype of rejection, of betrayal or abandonment, can manifest through either of those archetypes, right? Like a partner leaves you, or you're betrayed by people that you trusted, or you're kicked out of the group, right? Or your whole group is teaming up against you, things like that. But the energy of Mars Pluto as it relates to betrayal is, I'm fundamentally feeling threatened in some kind of essential way, and that's really triggering. Let me give a little bit. I didn't give any squares or oppositions, and I like to usually do that. And let's just appreciate the example of an opposition. Okay, we're gonna have the need for freedom and action, right? I need to do that. I need to go there. I need to have the freedom. Let's just say archetypally, put Mars in Taurus and Pluto in Scorpio, okay, opposite each other. The Mars in Taurus needs to feel underlying self-reliance and self-capacity to do things by themselves. I am resourceful and strong enough to survive and take care of what I need on my own. And I'm out there in the world relying on my own resourcefulness and strength and abilities. And then Scorpio, I'm getting involved in relationship or experiences with other people that are thwarting or limiting my own sense of value and self-esteem. I'm getting involved in entanglements where my energy is getting wrapped up or entangled in experiences that are beyond my capacity to control on my own. We're going to be faced with a Mars-Pluto opposition with psychological encounters and entanglements that are going to threaten our need for security. And we're going to feel like either I need to push, right? Or just kind of lose my power to the experience. Like we can get involved with someone sexually, Mars-Pluto opposition, and suddenly realize, okay, I was free, I was acting upon an impulse, but now I'm involved in something that is much bigger. All these deeper karmic entanglements of needs and attachments and psychological contents coming to the surface, and I'm feeling limited or afraid or blocked in some essential way. This is an important piece that I want to speak about. This is very much expressed in the opposition as per the nature of polarities, but this is a Mars-Pluto thing in general. A fear of commitment, right? I want to do this, but if I do this, I'm going to get sucked in. Right? If I make this choice, I'm going to lose my freedom or my individuality or my independence. I'm afraid that if I choose to focus on this goal, I'm going to lose some freedom. And there's truth in all of this. Like, we're going to lose some of our own range of possible choices when we make a single focused commitment. It's going to limit the narrowness of options. And it's going to perhaps bring us into more discomfort for the short term. And that's often a part of the program. But there can be an experience where there is this visceral sense of, and this is really important to speak to, a visceral sense of losing one's life. Right? It's like I'm jumping off of a cliff. I'm going to die. I'm going to lose. Like, the experience with Mars of losing one's ability to act and make one's choices for oneself is akin to not living. Giving up on one's agency and freedom to act is akin to losing one's life. So you can still be alive, but actually have lost that connection to yourself. So there's a fear of being consumed by commitment, entanglements, entrapment, situations greater than oneself, and then losing that agency. This can often lead a soul to actually fear commitment of all kinds, or to get involved in commitments and having that experience of being engulfed and then needing to really work out, how do I reclaim that power within myself at the same time? So that's an important piece to speak to here. Okay, let me see if there are any more questions on this. All right. Okay, thank you everyone for joining me for today's class. This completes our Mars-Pluto talk, and we'll get together again next week for Jupiter and Pluto. Till next time.